morning, mostly across central and eastern England. That should gradually clear, but it may take a while. The rain will be petering out from Northern Ireland and southern Scotland, eventually pushing up across northern Scotland, but not as heavy as the past couple of days. So many places brightening up during tomorrow, and it is going to be mild. Even where it stays glum across parts of northeast England, 13, 14, but with a bit of sunshine, 16, 17, maybe 18 degrees Celsius. Temperatures will drop through Saturday evening, but generally staying fairly mild. The rain petering out finally across northern Scotland. So most will be dry as we go through Saturday night. Again, some fog likely, and again, most likely over central and eastern parts of England, where it could be quite dense, and at this time of year, it can take quite a long time to clear. So for some, it may stay a bit drab and a bit grey on Sunday. Later on, some rain will trickle into the west of Northern Ireland, but most places, again, on Sunday should be dry, brightening up with some sunny spells. And yet again, it really won't feel like November with temperatures pretty high for the time of year.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something weird happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky.
That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak.
Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. There's never been a more interesting but also critical time in British politics, and I can't wait to bring you the biggest stories of the day with the best factual accuracy and also a few of my own opinions thrown in. We'll engage in passionate but always polite debate with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Monday to Thursday, 10 till 12 on TV, on radio and online.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing with me, Alastair Stewart, in for Arlene Foster. Here's what's coming up over the next hour. 2 major issues continue to dominate the agenda. Next week's autumn statement budget and the growing demand to improve public sector pay, and of course, Armistice Day. Today we have an exclusive interview with the former Chancellor, Philip Hammond, the reflections on Armistice of a former senior general in today's army, and a former president of the Royal College of Nursing. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the day's news. Here's Rhiannon.
Alastair, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 3. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Ukraine says it's in the final stages of reclaiming the strategic city of Kherson from Russia. Ukrainian soldiers have been celebrating the retreat of Russian troops, waving the national flag in the region's capital. Russia says the withdrawal is complete. Over 30,000 of its soldiers crossed the Dnipro River to the eastern bank this morning, with reports many of them drowned. Despite the retreat, the Kremlin claims Kherson is still part of Russia. Back here, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt's warning there's a tough road ahead, saying difficult decisions will be needed to restore confidence and economic stability. His comments come as the latest official figures show the UK economy contracted by 2% between July and September. The data from the Office for National Statistics follows the Bank of England's warning last week that the UK may be heading for a 2-year recession. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves has called the latest GDP figures extremely worrying.
Today's GDP numbers are incredibly concerning. They show that the economy has shrunk in the last 3 months, and indeed they show that we are now the only major G7 economy whose economy is still smaller than it was going into the COVID pandemic. So these series of crises are problems made in Downing Street, but it is ordinary working people here in Britain who are paying the price.
UK authorities and coastguards are preparing for a significant surge in small boats crossing the English Channel this weekend. Bad weather stopped migrants from illegally reaching the coast for almost a fortnight. But GBNews understands with the improving weather, crime groups from Albania are planning a mass launch of small boats from French beaches tomorrow morning. It'd be the first large-scale arrival since the end of last month, when just over 14,000 people arrived in 32 small boats. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the nation fell silent this morning for Armistice Day. Bells rang out across the country, including the recently restored Big Ben in London, ahead of 2 minutes silence to remember the war dead. The service was held at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire to pay tribute to all those who've served their country. Army veteran Robert Clark told GB News he'd be remembering all those involved in the armed forces, past and present.
We're incredibly grateful, I think, for the services, the parades, the role of the royal family, for example. This is obviously the first year King Charles is going to be heading the services on Sunday. And I think a lot of the armed forces community and the veterans are welcoming, as well as reflective of the passing of Her late Majesty the Queen, the role that she had with the armed forces.
A prolific online paedophile who exploited children as young as 7 has been jailed for 26 years. Jordan Croft, who's 26, abused girls online over a 2-year period before being caught by officers from the National Crime Agency. Croft forced his victims to become his sex slaves and blackmailed them into sending photos and videos performing sexual acts on themselves and others. 24 of his 26 victims were under the age of 18. Just Stop Oil has suspended its protest on the M25. The climate demonstrators say the pause will allow the government to do what they call the right thing. They want the government to stop new licences for the exploration of oil and other fossil fuels in the UK. The environmental group held up the M25 for 4 out of 5 days this week, causing disruption for motorists and leading to multiple arrests. And Heathrow Airport has said it won't be limiting passenger numbers this festive season as it gears up for its biggest Christmas in 3 years. The West London Airport had 50 million passengers pass through its doors so far this year, almost 75% of pre-pandemic levels. Heathrow says a passenger cap won't be needed this year as a good plan is in place ahead of the Christmas peak. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, it's back to the briefing with Alastair.
Thanks, Rhiannon. And as Rhiannon observed in her news bulletin, today does indeed mark 104 years since the guns fell silent on the Western Front. Across the country, events have been held to commemorate those who made the ultimate sacrifice with their lives to bring peace to the world. And each year we commemorate this moment with the red poppy, representing those resilient flowers that grew across the brutalised fields of conflict in the lowlands of Flanders. However, today is not just about the First World War. It's for all of those who have died in the line of active service. We will remember them in hope for a peaceful future. Never has this been so poignant at a time when warfare has returned to the European continent. I'm delighted to be joined now by former Commander of Joint Forces Command, General Sir Richard Barrons. General Sir Richard, always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm going to make an odd start to our conversation, but one that you will instantly recognise. One of the extraordinary things about remembrance is that it is classless. I saw a village hall plaque remembering those who fell being repaired on an episode of The Repair Shop. It began with Lieutenant Colonel Lord Alexander Thynne, DSO, and ran all the way through the privates, the corporals, the sergeant, all who had died. There is no class to Armistice or remembrance.
That's absolutely right. And the point you're making is that not only has war not been extinguished as a feature of human existence, it's also a fact that wars are won and fought by civilians. And if you look at the war in Ukraine, you're seeing, actually on both sides, people who just a few months ago had normal civilian lives being thrown into the turmoil of war, and in many cases dying or receiving life-changing injuries. And those lists on the war memorials across the United Kingdom typify exactly this point, that war is fought by civilians, it's not just fought by regular soldiers.
Endured. There's an amazing book of remembrance just inside Westminster Abbey on the right of the families who died during the Blitz in London in the Second World War, which in a sense speaks to my second point, and that is the very national nature of this event, from the King standing at the cenotaph with the chiefs of staff and other great dignitaries, to just ordinary folk paying their respects at little memorials on village greens. This is the United Kingdom standing together.
Yes, it is. And it reflects that when war occurs, and war will continue to occur, it touches everybody, not just the people in uniform who go and fight, but the families that remain behind and in many cases have to cope with the effects of the wounded returning and the loss of loved ones. It touches economy, industry, prosperity, security, values. This is a whole of society endeavour, and it's absolutely right that on this day, once a year, we all remember that war is something that affects us all when it comes.
You and your colleagues led a very different service, an army offering civil aid at home and medical aid abroad, a navy hunting down drug runners and people smugglers. But is that ethos still the same?
So I think we need to recognise we now live in a very different time from the sort of service I and my peers executed over about 30 to 40 years. So the wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, they were, if you like, away matches. They were interventions abroad which didn't really touch civil society, the normal daily life in the UK. They didn't shatter our economy, and they absolutely deeply affected those people who participated. But they are not like the war we're seeing in Ukraine, which touches everybody, and they're not like the risk of great power conflict between, say, liberal democracy and autocratic capitalism over the rest of this century. We are living once again in the era of existential risk and peril that our ancestors in the First and Second World War recognised and fought for.
Extraordinary, profound observation. Let me finish with this. The literature of war has always been tremendously important, from the poets of the day, particularly the poets of the First World War, right up to Sir Anthony Selden's recent Path of Peace, which is about his walking journey along the Western Front. When a poll shows that many young folk take a dim view of Winston Churchill, do you believe that we should be doing more in schools, more on education about this very subject?
So I think it's essential that every citizen has enough history in their education to understand the journey that their families, their country have travelled, and to be able to see the risk that we face today in a historical perspective, so that in history, as Mark Twain said, it doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. But we should also recognise that in the age we live in now, many of the youngsters who want to connect to war, they'll do it through TikTok and other forms of social media. It'll be a video record. They won't necessarily reach for the poetry in the way that previous generations did. But it's just as poignant.
Just as poignant indeed. General Sir Richard, thank you very much indeed for your time on this very special day to all of us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
General Sir Richard Barron's there. Always a pleasure to talk to him and hear his reflections on these matters. As Richard and I were saying there, it is a national commemoration, both today and leading up to Sunday. So let's cross live now this Friday to our reporters Dougie Beattie and Jack Carson, who've been at Armistice commemorations in their different parts of the country. And we start with Dougie.
Well, good afternoon. Light is just starting to fade here in Belfast. And of course, that 2-minute silence took place here at 11 o'clock. It is very poignant to the people of Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland is one part of the UK that per capita actually supplies quite a substantial amount of young men and women to the services. Nobody knows why, but it is traditionally so. And of course, there have been problems here in the past with troops being involved in the troubles of Northern Ireland, including policemen and the UDR, which was the part-time regiment of the British Army. All of those are now being brought back to court. Lots of cases being brought up to do with legacy issues, and they are a very prickly situation in Northern Ireland. Those veterans were promised that legislation would go through Westminster to make it law that they wouldn't be brought back time after time. And with all the goings on in the Tory government, of course, that hasn't happened. Now, last year, Dennis Hutchings was brought back and he died while on trial in Northern Ireland and was buried on Armistice Day. And I spoke to Paul Young of the Veterans Association.
Yes, well, last year was probably one of the most disgraceful episodes in the legal history of Northern Ireland as far as veterans are concerned. Because this time last year, we were burying Dennis Hutchings. He was the first soldier to be prosecuted under the legacy witch hunts. Unfortunately, Dennis, he died before he could finish his trial through serious illnesses. He was denied the right to be found not guilty. And that's why we've been protesting for people like Dennis and all this legacy witch hunts that's been going on, which has been taking our soldiers and security forces to court rather than those that committed the most horrendous human rights abuses against the public of Northern Ireland.
Dougie Beattie there with his guests in Northern Ireland, and on the right of your screen, if you're watching on television, and if you're listening on radio, you're just about to hear him, is Jack Carson. And Jack has been at the National Arboretum, and he joins us live now. Jack.
Yes, Alastair. Here at the Arboretum this morning, a service took place with members of the royal family. Their Royal Highnesses, the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, were here representing the family, as well as a member of government, the Defence Minister Alex Chalk, as well as, of course, local MP here, Michael Fabricant, along with servicemen and servicewomen and veterans here at the memorial to pay their own personal respects. The memorial here, the Armed Forces Memorial at the Arboretum, has 16,500 names inscribed on the walls, representing those servicemen and women who lost their lives and sacrificed. They gave the ultimate sacrifice from 1945 onwards. A poignant reminder that even though there hasn't been a world war since the end of 1945, that conflict has existed and people have still fought and died for this country. After the service, the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester paid personal tributes to those who lost their lives in 2021, and then made their way over to a different part of the Arboretum here, where they finished the planting of 26 trees here, which makes up part of the Queen's Green Canopy, of course, a memorial to Queen Elizabeth II all over the country, which was also part of her Platinum Jubilee as well. This is the first year that we actually know how many veterans there are in the UK. 2021 census data now shows us that 3.8% of the UK population is made up of veterans. That's just over 1.8 million. One of them, Major Rob Cross, was part of the the Queen's Gurkha Engineers for over 40 years, and I spoke to him a little bit earlier about his medals.
Well, the award was for service to Gurkha veterans, and Margaret and I have been volunteer workers for the Gurkha Welfare Trust for more than 20 years. But in addition to that, I've been involved here at the Arboretum since about 2000 8 or 9, and I designed and supervised the building of the memorial here for the Gurkha welfare, for the Gurkha regiments.
Jack and guests at the National Arboretum, and if you've not been there where he is standing right now, make an appointment to go. It is one of the most moving and powerful places I've had the honour to visit as well. And also there in the middle of the screen, Diggy Beattie, live for us in Northern Ireland. Thank you both and your guests very much indeed on this Armistice Day. Coming up, I was speaking to Lord George Fuchs about the latest developments at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. We'll also be talking to a former president of the Royal College of Nursing about the forward planning for the strikes. But is there a glimmer of hope in the atmosphere that the Secretary of State described? We'll be testing that right after this. But first, a short break.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for the briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, the briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart, and I'd invite you to join me at noon on Saturdays and Sundays for Alastair Stewart and Friends. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Now, here at GB News, I've never been happier. I get to choose the big stories that really interest me. We hear what you have to say, and you hear what I have to say. I really hope you can join me, noon on Saturdays and Sundays. Welcome back. President Biden's at COP27 Climate Summit in Egypt today, restating, we are led to believe, the United States' commitment to climate change goals and discussing America's efforts to reduce emissions. They are the second biggest emitters in the world. It's a sharp contrast from his predecessor and perhaps challenger in 2 years' time, Donald Trump. Well, as the second largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, the United States will set the tone on the direction of negotiations between the 200 or so countries who are there at the gathering. And I'm delighted to be joined now by Labour peer Lord George Folkes, who is also, he's a former senior member of the Climate Parliament, as well as being a former minister. And that Parliament is a network of politicians around the world. George, always good to see you. Thanks for joining us this Friday afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Alastair. Nice to be back talking to you again.
Good man. What's Joe Biden got to say this afternoon to make it more than just a post-election hurrah parade for the President of the United States?
Well, it's very good that Joe Biden is going. I think that's the first thing. And what he has to do is to reassure the poorer countries, particularly in Africa, that the richer countries are going to keep their promise. Last year in Glasgow, the rich countries promised that we would give £100 billion a year to help the poor countries. And we haven't done that. We need a guarantee from Joe Biden, and indeed from the UK government and other rich countries, that we will fulfill those promises. And I'm afraid at the moment that the UK government is really slipping back. It seems to have gone into hibernation. All right, Rishi Sunak went over there, but didn't make any promises. It didn't make anything clear and concrete. Unlike, I don't know if you remember, in 1997, Alastair, that John Prescott went over to Kyoto, and he led the whole discussion that created the Kyoto Protocol. And Britain needs to be taking that kind of positive role. I'll
tell you something else, George, that you may or may not remember. But in 1992, one John Major went to Rio for the Earth Summit, which was the kind of opening gig of all of these things. And Margaret Thatcher was the first UK Prime Minister really to say, hey, guys, we've got a problem that we've got to deal with here. But that money that you were talking about is the subject of quite a lively debate. Do you see it, George, as being, as it were, reparations for the damage that we as industrialised nations have done over the years? Or is it genuinely aid money that can help developing countries do the right thing? Because if it's reparations, I'll have nothing to do with it.
No, I don't like the use of the word reparation. And Ed Miliband refused to use that word on the BBC on Sunday. I think mitigation, and we are helping. Unfortunately, we've cut down, the UK government, the Tory government, have cut down the amount we're giving in aid from 0.7% to 0.5%. And a huge chunk of that is actually being used to house refugees here in the United Kingdom. So we don't have all that much money. We need to increase the amount of money. The reason we need to increase it is because we need to encourage people to stay in their home countries, to build up their own countries. So that they can continue to live there and prosper there. And that's what the £100 billion a year would help them to do. There are so many now. I think it's 600 million people in Africa who don't have electricity. So the pressure is on for them to exploit their oil and gas. And we need to discourage them from doing that and put them in the direction of solar, of onshore wind, of new nuclear, and that's what we ought to be doing here in the United Kingdom as well. And that's what the Labour government would do. I know you, like me, will be looking forward to the next Labour government.
Well, we both have very open minds in these matters, George, and always have done. I actually do agree with you. I wish the current Conservative government would get back on its alternative and renewable strategy, because, like you, I believe that is probably one of the better ways forward. But something that you will know, but folk listening to our conversation may not be as aware of, is that in the Middle East, the penny has dropped, curiously. I mean, Saudi Arabia now investing massively in a number of green energy projects. Egypt investing heavily in nuclear. OK, they're not a big oil producer, but Saudi are. They get it. They know the game is up. We need all of us to be following in their footsteps.
Absolutely right. And I think, unfortunately, there's been this hiatus in the United Kingdom. As I say, I think we've been in hibernation. The government has been in hibernation for the last few weeks, and is continuing that until next Thursday, when we have the budget. And then we may have some. At the moment, we've got very little legislation coming into the House of Commons and the House of Lords. But I'd also like to see the IMF playing a bigger part. I don't understand why the International Monetary Fund, which brings together all the rich countries, isn't playing a bigger part in helping in relation to climate change.
Final point, people who are watching us on television and for those who are listening to us on radio, just midway through that answer, we showed a picture of Biden. He has started speaking. So I'm going to ask you one final question and end our conversation. We're then going to take a news bulletin while the news gang behind me listen to the Biden speech, pick out the best bits, and we'll play them to our audiences. But my final question to you is this. You and I also go back a long way in student politics as well as real adult politics. Do you not agree with me that the Just Stop Oil protesters, who have very little public support, are essentially counterproductive to everything that you've always believed in, and I do too?
I think you've chosen exactly the right phrase. Counterproductive. What their aim, their ideas, I understand and sympathise with. The way they're trying to force them on us, the way they're trying to draw our attention to it is very, very unfortunate indeed.
And so that's a crystal clear message. They should stop it and get on with it. There was a member of the government, I think it was the Education Secretary, who said, they're bright young things and it looks as if a few of them have got a bob or two. Maybe they should be in Sharm el-Sheikh listening to the arguments, or even in China trying to protest there.
Absolutely. China or India, those are two big polluters as well. But I think if they started doing what they're doing here in China, they wouldn't last very long.
You make my point elegantly for me, George. A genuine pleasure. Have a great weekend. Thank you very much. Nice talking to you again.
Thank you, Alastair. Look forward to speaking to you again.
Good man. George Vokes there, former Scottish minister, but also a member of the Climate Parliament. And again, as you saw, they're just at the end of George's final comments, but I wanted to give him his run so that you hear that side of the argument too. President Biden is speaking right now in Sharm el-Sheikh. We are across it and we will fillet it and we will bring you up-to-date information on it. But first, we are going to take a break and go to the news. No, I beg your pardon. That's coming up in just a moment. In fact, we're going to go back to Armistice Day and the commemorations that have been taking place in Westminster, where Big Ben's famous bongs were indeed heard 11 times as the nation fell silent. Well, earlier, our correspondent Ellie Costello was there, and she spoke to Clive Jones, an Army veteran and a former Welsh Guardsman.
As a veteran on Armistice Day, I feel, in some respects, extremely proud to have served and serve my country. But on other sides, I do actually feel quite sad and lonely in some respects, because I do think back of those who I've lost, and I do think of their family and friends that are grieving, especially on days like today. A 2-minute silence for me is very important. I think of, first and foremost, my great-uncle Richard, who was a Second World War veteran, served in Normandy and sadly passed away in 1994. Obviously, there are members of my former regiment and friends that I have lost since, and I do think of them as well, and the family and friends that are also suffering as well at this time. I'm extremely proud to be a veteran, yes. It's gone from being a serving soldier and the camaraderie and everything that came with it. So actually, when you think of it, being a veteran, nothing much has changed. We still get the help from charities and organisations such as the Royal British Legion, and the camaraderie that you spend with veterans in your local community, especially on weekends such as this, is remarkable.
Ellie Costello there at Westminster talking to Welsh Guardsman veteran. Coming up, GB News presenter Gloria De Piero has an extraordinary and exclusive interview with former Chancellor Philip Hammond, and you'll need to remind yourselves that he's a former Conservative Chancellor. As you listen to his interview, we'll be hearing his views on next week's very tricky autumn statement. We'll also be talking to the former President of the Royal College of Nursing about the threatened strike and that big pay claim. But now, as promised, I apologise, I got it slightly in the wrong order, but now it is your news update with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Alastair. It's 3:31, your top stories from the GB newsroom. Ukraine says it's in the final stages of reclaiming the city of Kherson from Russia. Ukrainian soldiers have been celebrating the retreat of Russian troops, waving the national flag in the region's capital. Russia says the withdrawal is complete. Its soldiers crossed the Dnipro River to the eastern bank this morning, with reports many of them drowned. Despite the retreat, the Kremlin claims Kherson is still part of Russia. UK authorities and coastguards are preparing for a significant surge in small boats crossing the English Channel this weekend. GB News has seen evidence of up to 6,000 migrants waiting to cross near the northern coast of France. With the weather improving, we understand crime groups from Albania are planning a mass launch of small boats from tomorrow. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt's warning there's a tough road ahead, saying difficult decisions will be needed to restore confidence and economic stability. His comments come as the latest official figures show the UK economy contracted by 0.2% between July and September. The data from the Office for National Statistics follows the Bank of England's warning last week that the UK may be heading for a 2-year recession. And the Met Police says 58 people have been charged over the Just Stop Oil protests that shut parts of the M25 this week. Over the last 4 days, environmental activists blocked the busy motorway, forcing it to close in several places. A police officer was also injured during Wednesday's protests. Well, earlier today, the group said they will halt their demonstrations on the motorway, for now at least. TV online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Alastair Stewart will be back in just a moment.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness, brilliant.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Stein Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Stein Show.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes & Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dubes & Co.
Welcome back. I'm being told by the news desk people that Joe Biden's still warming up. Now, I pass no judgment upon the great man, but sometimes that takes a little longer than it does for some other politicians. But I promise you, as soon as he starts saying anything of substance, which, as George Folks said in my earlier interview, he really does need to, as a great leader, or leader of a great country, and the world's second biggest polluter. But the minute we do have that, I promise faithfully that we will bring it to you. But it ain't worth cutting to live as things stand at the moment. Now, back home, and the eagerly awaited autumn statement budget finally arrives next Thursday, with Chancellor Jeremy Hunt expected to outline £60 billion worth of spending cuts and tax rises. It has split opinion right down the middle in the world of economics and indeed in politics. So, GB News' Gloria De Piero sat down for an exclusive interview with a former Chancellor, Philip Hammond, to get his view on the upcoming statement. But the former Chancellor also spoke out about Boris Johnson removing the whip from him when he was a Conservative MP. Will he be watching Matt Hancock in the jungle? And can you recognise the stardust of who will be the leader of a party? This is Life and Times with Gloria De Piero.
Philip Hammond, thank you for agreeing to do this. You have had some very big jobs in government. The great offices of state, as they're known, Foreign Secretary, before that you were Defence Secretary. But I'm really interested in what it is like to be Chancellor. You were Chancellor between 2016 and 2019. What is the hardest thing about being the nation's Chancellor?
Well, I guess in normal times, the hardest thing is about reminding people that if the books don't balance, all the other good things you want to do, all the projects you want to finance, all the public services you want to maintain, just can't be sustained. And that's not always a message that people want to hear. But fiscal discipline is at the heart of being able to run high quality public services and have high private standards of living. My experience was a little bit different because, of course, between 2016 and 2019, the entire period was totally dominated by the question of how to interpret the Brexit vote and how to manage the process of trying from this potentially very damaging decision to leave the European Union, how to try to turn that into something which could be the basis for future success rather than future failure.
You mentioned fiscal discipline. How did you feel watching the quasi-Kwarteng budget?
Mildly astonished, I think is probably the right expression. Look, Liz Truss has never made any mistake of the fact that she believed as a sort of piece of political theory that slashing taxes would automatically lead to significant increases in growth and that this would be a way to reinvigorate the economy. Most economists don't agree with her. There are points where reducing taxes does have that effect. When the UK's income tax rate was cut from 83% to 60%, it had a galvanizing effect across the economy, as you'd expect. But cutting the top rate from 45 to 40 was never going to deliver enough additional revenue to make good the political damage and the broader loss of confidence that was created in the markets.
So Jeremy Hunt will be keen to avoid making those mistakes. You recently said, look, we're all going to have to pay high taxes if we want those public services that we all depend on. Some people would say, why not a wealth tax? Why not a windfall tax on the energy and the energy companies? Do ordinary people really have to foot the bill when they're struggling?
So first of all, why do we have to balance the books? Because for years now, we've avoided this issue by borrowing. When I was Chancellor, my opposite number was John McDonnell, who had a massive plan for more borrowing. Liz Truss had a plan for borrowing to fund tax cuts. The markets have now effectively told the British government, whoever's running it, enough with the borrowing. You've now got to balance the books. And that means as the population gets older, and it's getting sharply older during the 2020s, we either have to pay more taxes or we have to cut our public services and shape them differently or fund them differently. So if you want to maintain the same level of public services, there will have to be more tax revenue raised. Now, of course, it's tempting to think, well, that's fine, so long as someone else pays the taxes. As it happens, I am broadly in favour of a windfall tax, so long as it's sensibly structured and only tackles the genuinely windfall element, not the cyclical ups and downs that you get in energy markets, because energy companies plan around those cycles of lower profits and higher profits over different periods of years. But where genuine windfalls are earned, I think it is legitimate to tax them. And actually, I'd be quite surprised if Jeremy Hunt doesn't move further on some kind of a windfall tax when he announces his autumn statement. Wealth taxes, more taxes on rich people, of course, always very tempting for people who think that this is a way of avoiding the dilemma, do I want to pay more tax or do I want to see public services squeezed? But there just aren't enough rich people who are captive here in the UK. This is the thing to remember. Look around us in London, for example. We see lots of people with lots of wealth, but many of them do not live here, don't belong here in a way that means HMRC, the British government, can just reach out and grab tax from them without pushing them offshore, pushing them back to wherever they consider to be their home country or their home jurisdiction where their wealth belongs. And I think this is not a political judgment, it's a judgment of economists and independent observers. I heard Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England, saying it. If we want to have public services at the level we've currently got them, as our population gets older, we will have to pay more taxes, all of us, not just the rich. That's an arithmetical fact. It's not a political judgment.
With that in mind, can we, as a nation, afford to keep the pension triple lock? And can we afford, some people would say we can't not afford to do it, to increase benefits in line with prices?
Well, first of all, I expect that Jeremy Hunt's judgment in this statement will be that we have to go ahead with both maintaining the triple lock and the uprating in line with inflation, just because of the huge pressure that people on low incomes are under from rising prices and high inflation. But I do think in the longer run, there are two issues. One is around pensions. Is it really right that we should always uprate by the highest of wages, prices, or 2%? And I think that is quite difficult to justify, and not all pensioners are poor. So I think there is a case for looking again at the way we treat pensioners and possibly for distinguishing the poorest pensioners from the great body of pensioners, some of whom are really quite comfortably off. And on benefits generally, I think the challenge is that in a period when the pressure is on to keep inflation down, it means holding wages down, often to a level of increase below the rate of inflation. And you do have to ask yourself whether it is really fair and whether it's sustainable in the long run to see benefits for people not in work rising in line with inflation.
Some are in work.
At a time when, many people who are in work will be seeing their wages rising by less than inflation. I think that does raise an issue about fairness.
Liz Truss was your deputy, in effect, when you were Chancellor. She was Chief Secretary to the Treasury. You obviously knew her well. You must have known her well. You worked closely with her. This is not a particular question about Liz Truss. It's a question about whether one can spot who is going to emerge as a future Prime Minister. Of course, she was short-lived in that role. But can you spot, when you're sitting in cabinet or when you're working with somebody at close quarters, did you think, this woman, she's got whatever it is, she's going to end up being leader of our party?
Honestly, no, I didn't think that. And I think it is very, very difficult to spot that magic quality. I mean, obviously there are exceptions to that rule. And although I'm well known not to be a great Boris fan, no one could have doubted that there was a serious chance that Boris would end up as leader of the party. I think the same was true of Tony Blair in his time. It was just obvious that he was a person that was likely to make it to the top. But no, I think generally it is quite difficult to see. And sometimes people's qualities as a leader only come through during the campaign. I remember very well when David Cameron was fighting to become leader of the Conservative Party. Nobody paid that much attention to him until that campaign started. And then suddenly he looked like a leader, and he gathered a lot of momentum very quickly.
Did you ever want to be Prime Minister?
No, I didn't. Oh, I might have wanted to be, but I think one of the key things in life is to know your strengths and to know your weaknesses as well, to work out where you're likely to be successful and where you're likely to be less successful. And I was very happy to be Chancellor, a job that I've always wanted to do. I would not have succeeded in the weekly combat that is Prime Minister's questions. I think I could have done other aspects of the job perfectly well, but I know that I would have not made a success of that. Parliamentary performance was never my strong point. So I think you've got to know your weaknesses, know your strengths, and the point of a team is that you've got people with different strengths, and working together, you can present a strong bench to the country.
You mentioned Boris Johnson.
Did I? That was a mistake.
You said that though you weren't his biggest fan, it was obvious that he had the qualities, that it thing, that stood him in good stead to be Prime Minister.
I didn't say that. What I said was, I saw that sort of stardust that made me know that he was likely to become Prime Minister.
And that's important.
I do not think he had the qualities that make a good Prime Minister.
You said during the leadership contest that if he was elected as leader, therefore Prime Minister, then you wouldn't serve in his cabinet. It was a great period of turmoil, this, largely over Brexit and the government's position on it, and the parliamentary stalemate. You were one of those Conservative big figures that Boris Johnson withdrew the whip from. How did that feel?
Well, to be honest, first of all, it felt like a bad joke, and we all assumed it was a sort of petulant tantrum. But then it became clear he was actually serious, that he was going to try to purge the Tory party of people who didn't agree with him on this particular issue. And that was never going to work. The Tory party has been a very successful political party over many, many, many decades, and it's done it by being incredibly flexible, agile on policy, some might say policy light, but it's also done it by being a very broad church. And during my time in the Conservative Party, I've worked with people with pretty solidly right-wing views and people with views that would have been perfectly acceptable on the sort of right of the Labour Party. And that's the strength. That always has been the strength of the Conservative Party. As soon as you start chucking people overboard and trying to make it a narrow, focused elite of people who agree only with the leader, you're going to run into trouble pretty soon. And I think Boris Johnson and Liz Truss subsequently have proved that. Hopefully, Rishi Sunak is now back on the track of trying to make his cabinet more inclusive and get back to that sense of the Tory party as a broad church.
Budget morning. You're Chancellor. You were Chancellor. How do you prepare for a budget? What is going through your mind when you're preparing to give your statement to members of Parliament, but more importantly, the country? I mean, in recent memory, in living memory, certainly, Chancellors used to take an alcoholic drink with them while they delivered that statement. What are your tips for preparing?
Well, actually, my experience of budget mornings and party conference speech days was always the same. I hadn't quite got the speech right, and I was up at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock tinkering with it, trying to find that last joke or change a turn of phrase to make it flow a bit better. But my experience was always that the terrifying bit of politics was never delivering a scripted speech. I mean, the budget speech is an hour-long scripted speech. And, once writing it's the hard bit. Delivering it's pretty much straightforward. If you can read, you stand up and you read it out. I've always found the more difficult, challenging bits of politics, the interaction that you get in the House of Commons in questions, for example, or in debate, where you can be intervened on and challenged and asked to justify your position. You can read a budget speech from start to finish. Nobody's able to challenge you on a word you've said until you sit down at the end of it. So I never found the actual delivery of the speech particularly challenging. The 2 weeks before trying to write it were the nightmarish period when I think every single time I said, never, that's it, I've done enough now, I'm not going to do it anymore.
Final question. Are you watching any of I'm a Celebrity? Your former parliamentary House of Commons colleague, Matt Hancock, is in it.
No, I have watched I'm a Celebrity in the past, so I know what it's about. I am not a fan, and I will not be tuning in to watch Matt Hancock. I think I've seen probably quite enough of Matt Hancock to last me a lifetime.
Should he be there?
Oh, well, that's his decision. I think probably he's sending a pretty clear signal that he's decided to move on from politics.
I've just got to ask you, why did you say I've seen enough of Matt Hancock to last you a lifetime?
Oh, well, I've worked with Matt Hancock for a very long time, in opposition when he worked for George Osborne.
Yeah.
We were on the same team through various roles in government. I don't think I need to tune in and watch him in Australia.
Philip Hammond, thank you very much.
Absolutely brilliant. Gloria Di Piero is one of the best interviewers I've ever come across, and really worth it. So you can catch up with that interview again if you want to, and read into the nuances about what Phil had to say about Boris Johnson. I think, as far as Matt Hancock was concerned, it was pretty clear. That interview and all of her great interviews are on GB News YouTube. Seek them out. You will learn and enjoy. Now, finally, for the first time in their 106-year history, members of the Royal College of Nursing have voted to go on strike. The Royal College is requesting a pay rise of 5% above the rate of inflation as measured by RPI, which currently stands at 12%. The current offer from the government is 4.75% for nurses in England and Wales, full stop. Joining me now is Dame Anne-Marie Rafferty, former president of the Royal College of Nursing. Anne-Marie, really great to see you. Thank you very much indeed. The Secretary of State, Steve Barclay's talking to the RCN. That in itself is a good thing. But he also says there was a good atmosphere. Is that what you're hearing from your side, as it were?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm also a Professor of Health and Nursing Policy at King's College London. So I'm coming at this very much from more of a research and evidence base. But what I have heard is, and I think the word cordial was actually used by the Royal College of Nursing in describing the relations, if you like, the relational atmosphere of the meeting itself. So I think, this is a good moment to open up dialogue, because dialogue is definitely what's actually needed. And I'm just so delighted that people are getting round the table, because that's what just needs to happen, isn't it?
I totally agree with you, because a lack of cordiality and courtesy in the rail strike, I think, probably held it back for a long, long time. And talking is always very sensible. Here's another point, though, and I'm sorry I didn't mention your academic status as well in the introduction, but tying both of those together, former president and that academic status, you'll understand exactly where I'm coming from on this question. If the nurses, with or without a strike, were successful in getting a lot more money on pay, and I'm one who quite accepts the argument that they're making about getting more nurses into the profession to ease pressure and cut those waiting lists back down, there'll be less money left in the kitty to recruit the extra nurses at those improved rates. How do you nuance those twin demands?
Well, I think that the key issue here is actually retention. I think we've seen, the recruitment of nurses received a real boost from students during the pandemic, but actually that has dropped off by about 8% this year. So that's a slightly worrying trend. And the real issue is hanging on to those nurses who are already in the system, because that's where the investment has already happened in terms of training. And let's face it, nurses also invest in their own training as well. And they know through the labour that they're actually providing to the National Health Service. We know from data that actually nurses are also working many hours over the odds, uncompensated overtime, which in fact, if you were to add it up, and I've heard the figures quoted of, roughly speaking, nurses are working 1 extra day a week. That is free labour to the NHS. If you were to tot all of that up, it could actually come to billions over a long period of time. And certainly I think that suggests that nurses have been bearing the brunt of the resource constraints and austerity measures for the National Health Service for quite some time. And that's why they've just said, look, enough is enough. We just can't give anymore. The tank's empty. Something different has to happen.
That's a really important answer, and I just underline for those kind enough to be listening to our conversation that word retention. So if nurses who are in the job now stop leaving for all of the reasons Anne-Marie just outlined, then that would be a groundbreaker. Final question. In all of your years of experience, and indeed in mine as a former industrial correspondent, do you sense that there will be compromise in the air, that both sides might look across the precipice and think, no, not for us, we're nurses?
Well, I think the fact that we are having this dialogue and that a negotiation is actually going to take place would suggest that there's going to be a change in position on both sides. But I'm not a prophet, and probably I wouldn't be a professor in an academic institution if I were. But I'm not a betting woman, but I think the fact that we are getting together suggests that a solution and some form of resolution is possible if it moves in the right direction.
Fingers crossed on that brilliant note to end. Anne-Marie, thank you very much indeed. Professor Anne-Marie Rafferty there. You've been watching The Briefing with me, Alastair Stewart, and my excellent guests like Anne-Marie. I'm back at noon tomorrow. Next up on GB News, Nana Akua. But first, we're going to take a short break.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online,